Imam Saif Yoruba was the first ruler of the Omani Empire. From his base in southern Arabia, he conquered much of coastal East Africa, liberating the land from his Portuguese nemesis, and carving out his own colonial empire. So how did this happen? How did Oman become an Arabian colonial empire at the height of European colonialism? Saif Yoruba was born sometime in the mid-17th century. By the time of his birth, his father, Sultan, had become the Imam of Oman and had successfully unified the country against the colonial Portuguese. While Saif was the son of the Imam, his destiny was fated to be the second-born to his older brother, Bilarab. To describe these two brothers as complete opposites would be an understatement. Bilarab pursued more scholarly passions such as astronomy, while Saif was more like his father, a warrior through and through. In 1679, Imam Sultan died and was succeeded by Bilarab. The new Imam spent much of his time in his palace fortress of Jabrin and cared little for continuing the Portuguese War. After spending 10 years as a scholar, the Omani people became frustrated with their complacent ruler. The Omani army and navy wanted war, and he was simply not giving that, or much else to them. In 1689, Saif would openly declare war on his brother. Bilarab was helpless in the face of his country and his brother revolting against him. Saif would begin a long 3-year siege of Jabrin Castle. The fort could have held indefinitely, and it only conceded to Saif once Bilarab had died mysteriously. So it is, in 1692, that Saif became the new Imam of Oman. Once asserting his reign by traveling to Muscat, Saif moved the royal palace from Jabrin to Rustak Fort, the very place where the elections of the Yoruba Imams took place. At the start of his reign, he reinvigorated the war against the Portuguese, sponsoring wide-scale piracy that brought in vast wealth. With this wealth, Saif began to build underwater aqueducts that connected the interior freshwater wells to the arid coast of Oman. He also began to use his own pockets to plant fruit trees along the coast, a majority of which being date palms. The purpose for doing this was to inspire more people to live on the coast. This would benefit Saif by supplying him with more readily available soldiers and boat makers, thus strengthening an already dominant navy. By doing this, it also had the important side effect of helping to break up the interior tribes and, in turn, break up the tribal disputes that had plagued Oman for much of its history. These new coastal settlers could be considered the start of a new Omani people. After building up his navy for 4 years, he decided it was due time to bring the fight to the Portuguese. In 1696, Imam Saif's navy sailed down the coast of East Africa until reaching the Portuguese-controlled city of Mombasa in modern-day Kenya. Nearly 40 years ago, Saif's father had came to Mombasa, briefly conquering the city until the Portuguese recaptured it in the following year. Saif was here to finish his work. The siege of Mombasa mostly centered around the Portuguese fort of Jesus, which protected the harbor of the city. Fort Jesus was only manned by 70 Portuguese soldiers, along with a force of 500 soldiers from the allied queen of Zanzibar, Fatuma. The Omanis surrounded the fort by land and blockaded the port from reinforcement. Fort Jesus, despite its small garrison, managed to hold out for a year before Saif withdrew to his boats and sailed away. But he didn't sail back to Oman. Venturing south, the Omani Marines stormed the island of Zanzibar and take Queen Fatuma hostage. This was prompted when Fatuma attempted to sneak supplies into Mombasa. The queen was transported back to Oman, while Saif installed her son as the first tributary vassal of the Omani Empire. After this brief excursion, the Omani Navy returned to Fort Jesus in early 1697. Whilst he was gone, the Portuguese hadn't received any reinforcements, and all of the Westerners had died from disease. This left an allied Muslim trader as the head of the fort. By this time, there were only 25 men and 50 women to hold off all of Oman. Fort Jesus was relieved on 2 separate occasions when Portuguese vessels managed to breach the blockade. However, the soldiers that came into Mombasa never came out. as they all died from disease once more. By the end of 1698, starvation had taken hold, and only 11 men remained. The time to strike had come. The Omani army storms the few brave soldiers, killing them all. After 33 months of siege, Mombasa and Zanzibar had fallen into the hands of the Omani Empire. The army only stayed for a short time repairing Fort Jesus and installing an Arabian governor to watch over this far-flung African colony. At the start of 1699, the navy leaves Mombasa, again sailing in the opposite direction of Oman. First, the Omani army captures the island of Pemba. Then they turn their attention to conquering the mainland coast of East Africa and take territories all the way down to their Zanzibari vassal. After this, the army continues venturing south, conducting a raid on the Portuguese-controlled island of Mozambique before finally returning to Oman. Shortly after the Omanis pillaged Mozambique, the Portuguese had finally sent a 1,000-man army to reinforce Mombasa. They arrived in Mozambique, witnessing the destruction left behind. Not having yet received word that Mombasa had fallen, the Portuguese sailed there, only to see that it was firmly in the hands of Imam Saif. The Portuguese decided not to attack. Instead, they landed on Zanzibar and succeeded in taking control of the island. However, in a short few months, disease overran the Portuguese camp and they retreated to India. Shortly after they left, Imam Saif re-established control over Zanzibar. In 1700 and 1701, the Portuguese sent armies to retake their East African holdings. They both failed, as disease had killed more of Oman's enemies for them than they themselves. With this, the Portuguese largely gave up on recapturing their colonies, leaving them to the new colonial empire in town. Oman just beat Portugal at their own game. The colonized was now the colonizer. However, the Omani brand of colonialism differed from the Portuguese. For starters, the Africans were much more willing to accept Islam than Christianity, as they already had contact with this religion. The Omani Empire was also very intermixed, Arabians settling down in Mombasa and Africans migrating to Muscat. The concept of race meant very little to the new empire, at least when compared to the Portuguese. The Portuguese also only built small trading forts in key cities on the coast, focusing their full attention on earning and exploiting wealth from the locals. While Imam Saif still did profit heavily from his new colonies, he was also a true ruler of the land that he had conquered, building many forts on the Kenyan coast as well as on Zanzibar. Having liberated East Africa, Imam Saif took a small break from war, rebuilding his navy and preparing for his next target. In 1703, the Omani navy sets course for India, which was home to a multitude of Portuguese trading forts. On the island of Salsette, the Omanis captured the poorly defended fort and looted the island for all its goods before returning to their imam. With these triumphs over the Portuguese, a vast wealth suddenly flowed into Oman's coffers. Imam Saif pumped this newfound gold directly back into his empire. He built more underwater aqueducts and planted numerous fruit trees. He also funded the construction of many new schools in Oman, even founding a naval school in Muscat. Apart from improving the everyday life of his people, he also added onto his seat of power, Rustak Fortress, ordering the construction of a 40-foot tall round tower that would come to be called the Wind Tower. The interior incorporated hundreds of triangles into its walls, beckoning back to his brother's castle at Jabrin. In 1711, Imam Saif Yoruba would pass away. He was said to be buried in a large and immaculate tomb. Unfortunately, this final resting place was disturbed and destroyed during an Omani civil war in the mid-19th century. Saif would be succeeded by his son, Imam Sultan II, who reigned over the Omani Empire peacefully for 7 years before his death in 1718. Imam Sultan left a young son behind to become the new ruler, causing a 30-year civil war that would eventually see the overthrow of the Yoruba dynasty and the start of a new ruling family in Oman. However, that is a story for another day. The story of Imam Saif in the First Omani Empire is one of the biggest exceptions in world history. In a time where European powers dominated the open seas and set up faraway colonies, Oman did the same thing, while also repeatedly beating their Portuguese nemesis. Although largely forgotten, they were the only Arab colonial empire.